Thank you, thank you very much, and thank you to both speakers. And I agree. I think actually where Ireland has had impact and credibility, personally, I think is when we have taken action. Because I sat through 2 Oireachtas terms in which we were told we were trying to get people on board very slowly, and when nothing was done, when no legislation was moved forward, when the Occupied Territories Bill and others were delayed, and in fact the situation deteriorated during that period of time. And actually where Ireland, I think, has won influence in Europe has been where it has led, when it has actually led by through recognition, and is leading, I hope, soon in relation to the Occupied Territories Bill, and indeed in terms of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. It is actually action that has had the impact, Ireland's actions, not holding back on action. But going to just where you left off, because I think this is something I've been consistent on. I believe the international law and its paramountcy is perfect. I'm going to come to questions on that. But just also within the prospectus itself, you know, as you mentioned paragraph 88, paragraph 88 explicitly references that all of this should be interpreted. You know, it says that this isn't, and this is the kind of due diligence, this is the kind of, you know, obviously when the prospectus was designed, they didn't simply have a checkbox and say, if it ticks these 3 boxes, it's okay. They also put in a paragraph that said this should all be interpreted in line with the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And when you go to that charter talks about things having, you know, the universality in relation to human rights, and also the obligation in terms of rule of law. So that's, you know, it strikes me as due diligence isn't simply 3 keywords. It is a matter of, you know, the prospectus itself anticipated that there may be need to interpret this and have reference to rights. And that was in paragraph 88, which again is a sufficient basis. I mean, maybe you can give your opinion, but do you believe that's a sufficient basis if the central bank had chosen to lean on that paragraph and apply an interpretation in terms of rule of law? The other aspect of this, you mentioned completeness. So the 3 categories we're told constantly are required was, I think it's comprehensibility, a consistency between the advertisements and the prospectus, and then completeness. But in the bonds, it seems to be that the completeness, you know, there is issue of completeness, and there is this, you know, maybe you could kind of elaborate on this, but the bank would have had powers to, at a minimum, request complete information. So the points you've highlighted are missing was that there's a lack of reference to the ICJ interim ruling from January. There's a lack of reference. I think there's a single line that says South Africa has taken a case, but it doesn't mention that case against Israel, that it's a case under the Genocide Convention. There is no reference to the battle testing issue, as you mentioned. And there is no reference to the International Court of Justice ruling from July in relation to illegally occupied territories. So they seem to be very big missing pieces. Maybe could you elaborate on what you believe the bank could have done under the many powers it has in relation to those? And then going to Mr. Nuzbe, on the international, on that ruling from July 2024, you referenced one paragraph, the paragraph around assisting, but I wanted to highlight a different paragraph, which is paragraph 278. Which talks about how member states have an obligation to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. So again, this is an active duty or an obligation to prevent trade or investment. And in terms of specifically, we focused a lot on the Genocide Convention. If you could talk a little bit about that ruling in relation to the illegally occupied territories and that illegal act, and maybe 2 aspects of it that I feel we were just beginning to unpick at the end of the central bank's session last week, whereby there is the question of the funds, because as I understand it, the prospectus indicates the funds go into the general Israeli expenditure. We know that I think 6.5 billion has been spent by the State of Israel in the construction of settlement buildings, internal roads, utilities. That's leaving aside the funding of the Israeli Defence Forces and so forth. So, you know, how clear is the argument that these funds are being used to assist in the maintenance of an illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied territories. And then separately, and this is coming back to the kind of trying to join the two together, that risk point, because the ultimate obligation under the prospectus is to protect investors from risk. Is there, leaving aside the risk to states, which I think you've been very clear on, the risk that Ireland is taking by not acting, but the risk for investors doesn't seem to have been properly addressed in terms of their risk of their contributing to illegal actions, but then also, because I understand they are paid centrally from the Israeli exchequer also, who gathers VAT and tax and revenue and profits from illegally occupied territories, and so they are being paid from a pool which draws from illegally acquired funds. So maybe if you could just comment on a little bit more, like on the other ruling, that occupied territories, because with that it seems really crystal clear in terms of, and if you talk to the risk for the state in relation to that ruling, and also the risk to investors, which goes back to my point to Ms. Mahoney, which was that question of, are they even doing what they were meant to be doing under the prospectus regulation, in your opinion?
Okay, so we'll bring it back to the panel. I think there's questions for both, so if you want to share at the time.
First, I want to maybe to mention one more case that is very relevant and very important, and that I think Ireland also should look at, which is a case Nicaragua versus Germany. It's much less covered in the media, so people don't know much about it, but I think it's very relevant for our discussion right now. Nicaragua has filed a case in the International Court of Justice against Germany a year ago, where it argues that by supporting Israel during the time of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other violations of international humanitarian law, Germany must be held liable for that contribution. And this is, of course, an important case because it's not about Israel. It's actually about Germany. It's about German contribution to crimes only from the relationships that Germany has with Israel. Of course, there is no decision yet. We will have to wait for a few years for that decision. But from my own expectations, I would think that the court will find Germany liable for a number of acts that it has done to support Israel because of Israel's violations. So that's an important thing to take into account as well when considering Ireland's responsibility. Now, regarding the advisory opinion. The advisory opinion was requested from the UN General Assembly, and the question was, first, the consequences of the continued Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory, including the settlement building and also and other measures that Israel is taking in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also the question was about the discriminatory measures that Israel is taking against the Palestinian people. After deliberations in the court, which was the biggest the biggest case in terms of state contribution within the court deliberations, the court found that the Israeli ongoing presence, mere presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is contrary to international law for several reasons. On the one hand, it violates the Palestinians' right to self-determination on a basis that is intended to be permanent, but also because of the colonization of the occupied Palestinian territory, the forcible displacement, and many other ongoing violations. But also, in addition to that, the court found that Israel is breaching Article 3 of CERD, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and this article prohibits racial segregation and apartheid. So basically, the court has also found that there is an apartheid regime that is being implemented, at least within the occupied Palestinian territory. And at the end of this ruling, or this advisory opinion, the court established the responsibilities. So on the one hand, the responsibilities of Israel to end the occupation, etc., and on the other hand, the responsibilities of every country around the world, as you mentioned, not to support and also to prevent these crimes from happening. Okay.
Ms. Mahoney, did you want to come in briefly?
Just very briefly,
Yeah.
actually, I think Section 88 of the preamble is absolutely crucial. It says that the prospectus regulation has to be in accordance with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that's not optional. That's absolutely essential. And absolutely, the prospectus is seriously incomplete, and it amounts to the withholding of risk-related information from investors. And in terms of the prospectus regulation, there are a couple of sections. There's recital 54, there's Article 16. Both of them require the issuer provide complete information, especially in relation to risks, and it doesn't.
Okay, seconds.
Yeah, quick one-liner. So my specific question, I suppose, was not generally about that ruling, but around that piece of risk. So we were told by Mr. McLeod that in the end, can Israel pay back the bonds, was the ultimate question they were asking. But where there is a risk of those bonds being paid back from monies that are basically gathered in revenue from illegally occupied territories, in terms of just the perspective, in terms of where that comes in due diligence, and even in terms of, we have heard suggestions that there may be money laundering implication. So isn't that both a risk to investors as well as in terms of, but on that piece about how the money that is being paid back is coming in? I just like a really brief comment on that.
Seconds, if somebody has a response for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The risk to investors from being paid back from funds that are raised from the illegal settlements is a serious risk to the investors, and it should be there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bogam Raigo, Teach na Nash.